Rising damp, myth or fact? For a number of years now, a number of individuals have emphatically denied the existence of rising damp. Their views have been published on YouTube and other social media. However, perhaps the most noticeable has been the author of the publication, The Rising Damp Myth. The following presentation is a review of rising damp. Is it a myth or a documented, proven fact? Well, first of all, what is rising damp? Could be defined simply as the vertical movement of water up through masonry, the water originating from groundwater. Broadly, porous masonry acts like a wick. In the rising water are dissolved salts. These are deposited as the water evaporates. So, rising damp is a myth. So what's the definition of a myth? Well, any fictitious story or unscientific account or belief, or person or thing whose existence is fictional or unproven. So if we look at the rising damp myth, it states, "For the fact is that rising damp is a mythical building defect, which only came to widespread prominence in the 1960s. It continues by saying, "The rising damp myth has become so powerful and so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the construction professions that to question it is to invite denial and even ridicule." The author of The Rising Damp Myth and other individuals say that rising damp must be, therefore, by definition, unscientific account or a belief, and fictional or unproven. Ergo, it doesn't exist. Let's have a look at some past quotes in relation to this. Architect's Journal. Rising damp is as rare as rocking horse beep from an architect. Architect's Journal 2009. Somebody of the construction arm of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors has told the Institute's 40,000 members that true rising damp is a myth and chemically injected damp-proof courses are a complete waste of money. And from another website, rising damp is a figment of building surveyors' imagination. It doesn't exist. So what was the origin of the term rising damp? Well, in The Rising Damp Myth, the author states, "The earliest use of the phrase rising damp that I could find in official literature was from 1951. However, Transactional Royal Institute of British Architects, 1862 to 63, rising damp is mentioned. Helps to Health by Sir Henry Burdett, 1884-5, rising damp is mentioned. A treatise on hygiene and public health in 1898, rising damp is mentioned. Building News and Architectural Review, 1862. Note the ill effects of damp rising up the walls by capillary attraction, in other words, rising damp. Household Words by Charles Dickens, 1881. A Pattern for Physical Damp-Proof Courses, 1841. And finally, British Medical Journal, 1872. It mentions rising damp and damp course. And we come to the author's own practical research into rising damp. When he was at South Bank University, he carried out some sponsored research in the laboratory during the mid-1990s to simulate rising damp. This involved building brick pillars and setting them in water. It was published in several newspapers, but what did the Architect's Journal write about this work in 2009 following the publication of The Rising Damp Myth a year earlier in 2000? Well, this is what they wrote. Jeff Howell, a qualified bricklayer and author of The Rising Damp Myth, said trials in the laboratory confirm the falsehood, that is, of rising damp. If you build a brick pillar and stand it in a tray of water, the bricks in the water will get wet, but the water doesn't rise by capillary action, he said. Cement-based and most lime-based mortars will not allow water to go through. Remember, this was sponsored work. However, a letter from the author to one of the sponsors in 1994 stated, in the foreground there are two pillars of Ibstock red Leicester facing bricks, which are nicely wet up to 5 courses and starting to show a pattern of efflorescence at the evaporative surface. Behind them, 2 pillars of LBC flattens, not so damp, but interestingly, the mortar is visible up to the 6th course. And a letter from the author to the same sponsor. A year later, this wall had been standing in water for 8 months and had some hygroscopic salt contamination. It had rising damp, which was visible up to a level of approximately 500 millimeters. It therefore represented a typical rising damp complex. Well, quite simply, if it was typical, then it is common, and he therefore must have had experiences of rising damp in the field. So how does his research at a university support his rising damp myth when he wrote the following? And we've just covered that. Well, it could be argued it's distinctly disingenuous and stupid. So let's have a closer look at rising damp. How can we define it as a starters? Well, we could define it as the vertical movement of water up through the masonry, the water originating from groundwater. The water rises through a series of interconnecting pores by a process called capillarity. Broadly, porous masonry acts like a wick. Also, groundwater contains dissolved salts, and these rise with the water and are deposited as the water evaporates. So this is how a rising damp complex works. At the bottom there we have soluble chlorides, nitrates, sulfates, anything basically that's soluble in groundwater. And the water rises with these soluble materials. As the water continues to rise and slowly evaporate, it leaves the salts behind, and these accumulate over many years. And there's the water evaporating, rising and evaporating, and it leaves the salts behind. We have a salt concentration at the top of the rise where it forms a typical salt band, but at the base of the wall typically there's nothing really significant in the way of salts and other materials. That's typical, but it does vary. So if we look at a wall then, we have the lower parts of the wall. If there's rising damp, we'd expect to find water and groundwater salts, e.g. chloride and nitrate are the most common, whereas above a certain height we wouldn't expect to find any water or groundwater salts. Thus, the presence and distribution of the salts in relation to the presence and distribution of moisture are the keys to the diagnosis of rising damp. It is therefore essential to determine both. The most common method of evaluating moisture in building materials such as mortar, etc. is given in Building Research Establishment Digest 245, aptly named Rising Damp in Walls, Diagnosis and Treatment. The method described in the digest is designed to determine the following. If we take a material, the total moisture content of that material is potentially the sum of 2 components. The first component is known as the air-dry or hygroscopic moisture content. And this is moisture in a material when it's in equilibrium with the air, and it's what we would regard as a dry material. That is, where there's no water ingress. It's a material's standing level of moisture, and it does vary with the surrounding humidity. The second component is known If it is there, of course, it is known as the capillary or free moisture content, moisture that fills the capillaries of a material. It is only present where there is an active source of water ingress. It is this water that usually causes the problem. And that's the analytical method as described in the Building Research Establishment Digest 245. Note at the very bottom it says the presence of capillary or free moisture in a material indicates a source of water ingress. The principle behind the method is very simple. If the sample, once removed, loses weight, it has dried out. In other words, it lost water. Thus, it contained free moisture, and therefore it was subject to a source of water ingress at the time of its removal. If the sample does not change in weight after it's being removed, indeed it may gain, it was dry, that is, not subject to water ingress at the time of its removal. It is important to note that the method identifies the presence of water ingress if it is occurring. It does not necessarily on its own identify specifically rising damp, and certainly not from a single sample. The author explains the method in the rising damp myth, but he has completely misunderstood how the results are interpreted. He states, if the sample gains weight, then it was contaminated with salts and therefore possibly affected by groundwater. This is odd really, because could the groundwater be from the mythical rising damp? If it loses weight, then, he states, its moisture content was more likely due to a non-salt contaminated moisture source such as rainwater or condensation. If we look at this, it's quite evident that the author's interpretations are nonsense and wrong. The correct explanation is as follows, and it is explained in the digest. If the sample loses weight, it simply shows it was subject to water ingress from some source. If the sample gains weight, then it was dry, no water ingress, and removed from a relative humidity lower than that of the test conditions. It does not necessarily reflect salt contamination. Based on Mr. Howell's explanation, one could never find rising damp, and may well explain why he has never found it, or so he claims. He clearly doesn't appear to understand the published method and interpretation of results. Going back again to our diagram of our rising damp, it is the presence and distribution of salts in relation to the presence of moisture that are the keys to its diagnosis. And if we want to look at rising damp, we really need to look at moisture and salt profiles, a vertical series of samples in which we can carry out our analyses of moisture and salts. Case study, a profile. There we go. What we're interested in is the capillary moisture content, the free moisture, water that shouldn't be there. And in this case, we can see it is present up to a height of 1200 millimeters. We've got a lot of water at the base that shouldn't be there, and it declines going up the wall, which indicates it's coming from the base. However, also note we have salt contamination up to the same height. Above that height, there is no significant levels of salts. This is an indication, 1, the wall has got rising damp, 2, it is still active, fully active, because the salts always mark the maximum height to which water has risen. In this case, the salts are rising to 1200 millimeter, as is the water. Another one. This was an 1830s terrace house, and again the moisture and salt profiles. And we can see the moisture in this case has risen to 1500 millimeters, a lot at the base rising upwards. However, we also find salts, but this time to 1750 millimeters, our groundwater salts, nothing above that. So what does this tell us? Well, we know from the position of the salts that the moisture once rose to, it was groundwater because that's where the salts have come from, to 1750 millimetres, but now it's only rising to 1500 millimetres. Therefore, there has been a small dryback. Finally, a 16th century building, 500 years old. Again, doing the same exercise, a moisture and salt profile, moisture profiling as described in Building Research Establishment Digest 245. In this case, we got a little bit of water ingress, up to 250 millimetres. However, note that the salts are present, and hell of a lot. After all, it's had rising damp based on this for a long time. They're present up to 1250 millimetres. So we know at one time the salts, or rather the water, rose to 1250 millimetres as identified by the presence of salts, but now it's only rising to 250 millimetres. It's dried back a lot. So that was an example of rising damp and the methodology. Well, let's have a look to see how the myth has been manipulated. Well, let's go back. Is this ridiculous or just a good story? And it comes from the rising damp myth, from the author who stated, I had told him, Sharp, more about Bob Sharp in a minute, that I had been unable to find a single case of genuine rising damp. His reply was short and to the point. Well, he said, neither could we. And the author in the book continues to tell us that Bob Sharp was BRE's top expert on dampness in buildings. He was the author of many papers, reports and digests on the subject, and including the landmark BRE Digest 245, which he's just been talking about, which presented the definitive official view of the diagnosis of rising damp. To hear him say that he never found a genuine case of rising damp in the British House was astonishing. And it was still odd to hear from the top expert that the whole subject of rising damp and, by definition, the entire workings of the British damp-proofing industry were based on the myth. But if, as alleged, Bob Sharp, and hence our own Building Research Establishment, had never found a genuine case of rising damp in the British House, then one must simply ask, how did Building Research Establishment and Bob Sharp manage to produce, and I quote, many papers, reports and digests on the subject, including the landmark BRE Digest 245, which presented the definitive official view of the diagnosis of rising damp on something they never found? And if it was all effectively fabricated, as indeed it is implied in the book, then who and what government department authorised the fabrication and labelling of the photos and data in the digests and other publications for a period in excess of 20 years? And if we look at these digests from 1981 to 2007, is this the fabricated evidence that they published? Rising damp. Left photograph, rising damp. A British house, where rising damp is. A salt profile from rising damp. Rising damp in a wall externally. A British house showing rising damp. Again, rising damp in a British house on the far right bottom photograph. All rising damp identified by Building Research Establishment between 1981 and 2007. And it's being implied that this is all fabricated. More fabricated evidence. Another publication. Works by Harrison and Trotman. They're both in BRE. They examined a large number of properties in the Cardiff Bay area and sampled in accordance with a method described in BRE Digest 245. And in their report, they stated rising damp occurred in 76% of party walls, or 54 of internal freestanding walls. And some of the many other published authoritative reviews, I'm not going to read them out, but at the bottom, and they're from peer-reviewed journals, authoritative reviews, but at the bottom note, the reviews contain over 50 worldwide references to rising damp in buildings. Now, is this ridiculous or just another good story? I'll just recap a bit here. Mr. Howell in his book states that Bob Sharp was BRE's top experts, etc., including the landmark BRE Digest 245, which presented the definitive official view of the diagnosis of rising damp. So, top person. Again from the book, Bob Sharp in 1978 found that pressure injection of the damp-proofing fluid into his test pillars was completely ineffective in producing a damp-proof course. It was clear that no damp-proof course had been established in either brick or mortar at this stage, and Sharp found this had not been enough to produce an effective damp-proof course. However, if you actually read the paper, and reading the abstract, which is at the beginning, and the conclusions, Sharp concluded a test wall was constructed using a particular grading of wash sand, in which a substantial moisture gradient was created. When this wall was injected, an effective damp-proof course was formed. This could well form the basis of a realistic performance test of damp-proofing treatments. So why do we have the difference quoted from the same paper? Well, the author of the Rising Damp Myth chose to quote from the mid part of the paper where the test was being developed, and not the final evaluation and conclusions. I think you've got to agree that this is distinctly false, unethical, and deliberately, grossly misleading. We now come to the British Standard 6576 of 2005. Was also first produced in 1985. So what's it called? Code of Practice for Diagnosis of Rising Damp in Walls of Buildings and Installation of Chemical Damp-Proof Courses. In the Rising Damp Myth, the author quotes the following. Bob Sharp told me that there were two main reasons why BRE was under pressure, I doubt that, to produce rising damp in the laboratory. The other reason was to contribute the writing of the British Standard 6576. The British Standard Committee for this purpose included, funnily enough, representatives from major damp-proofing companies who had themselves been unable to reproduce rising damp under laboratory conditions. Fact. BRE did develop a laboratory test for rising damp, as we've just mentioned earlier. Bob Sharp developed it and published this in 1978, as indeed have other countries developed methodology. A similar method to that Sharp developed is used by the UK's British Board of Agrimon for testing, and several suppliers of damp-proofing materials did reproduce rising damp under laboratory conditions, and this included one installer. So who was the BSI committee responsible for 6576? Well, let's just have a look at a couple of them. The Association of Building Engineers, where we go down, Royal Institute of British Architects, the NHBC, British Board of Agrimon, Building Research Establishment, and indeed the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, just to name some of them. It also begs the question, if we look at those groups, why would a group of such eminent and knowledgeable organisations, including BRE, RIBA, ABE, etc., experienced in the built environment and the materials, gather and conspire to fabricate a British standard in 1985 and 2005 about a matter that is, according to Mr. Howell and some of the others, a complete myth and doesn't exist? We're also told in the rising damp myth that rising damp, it seems, was a peculiar British phenomenon. However, Australia, Salt Attack and Rising Damp, a guide to salt damp in historic and older buildings, that is from the Heritage Council of New South Wales, South Australian Department for Environment and Heritage. There's some pictures there of rising damp and injection of damp-proof courses. Belgian Research Establishment. Rising damp when translated, and look, they've built brick pillars, such as those mentioned by Howell and indeed Bob Sharp earlier. That's what they're using for testing. Countries where rising damp has been studied, there's a whole list of them, even America. So, review and conclusion. Well, based on the practical and supplied evidence from a large number of sources, including peer-reviewed international institutions, rising damp has been reported from at least the early 1800s, that is, for over 250 years. Rising damp has some unique features which can be readily diagnosed using basic and authoritative analytical methodology. Rising damp is a well understood and an identified feature which can occur in some buildings. It is a fact, not a myth, and was not originated or perpetuated by the UK damp-proofing industry. Rising damp is well recorded in Belgium and the rest of Europe effectively, and in Australia and the United States, all of which have produced authoritative peer-reviewed publications on this subject. It is not solely a UK problem. And the rising damp myth by Jeff Howell? Well, the contents are diametrically opposite to many years of researched and published facts from national and international peer-reviewed institutes and publications. The reported conversations and situations with Building Research Establishment and Bob Sharp are simply unbelievable and not consistent with over 20 years of BRE's own research and published evidence. The author contradicts himself on numerous occasions, even his own work back in mid-1990s. And there is a failure to understand basic science, no rigour or objective evidence to support his claims. And finally, one really must ask, why would eminent and knowledgeable organisations and major European and Australian laboratories and universities, all with experienced staff, work and publish on rising damp for many years, only to be told by a few individuals that it is a myth? Unlike the aforementioned establishment, the Rising Damp Myth book and others have never provided any evidence whatsoever to support their claim. So, does the rising damp myth, as proposed by a number of individuals, become so powerful and so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the construction professions that to question it is to invite denial and even ridicule? Indeed, does the evidence support the myth, or does it support rising damp as a proven fact? You will have to make your own mind up on this matter. Rising damp, myth or fact? The end. Thank you very much for listening.